Basically, my recognition that we cannot exploit geostrategically the advantageous implications for us of the Sino-Soviet rift. Kissinger and Nixon did a great deal, but they couldn't really engage in coordinated policy that would increase the pressure on the Soviet Union at a time when the Soviet Union seemed to be rolling forward. You know, we lost in Vietnam, they were assertive, they were building up their nuclear arsenal, they were beginning to claim that they have superiority, and Khrushchev was telling us, we'll bury you. So I thought the fact that the Chinese were resentful of Soviet domination should be something that we ought to exploit, and on that basis establish a longer-range relationship with a China that someday is going to rise for sure. And we were lucky in the sense that the Chinese by then were pretty outraged by the Russians, were fearful of their conduct. They seriously considered even the possibility of a Russian military invasion from Mongolia at the very heart of China, pointing at Beijing, and therefore under Deng Xiaoping were in a receptive mood potentially. But to make that possible, we had to bite the bullet. And President Carter had the courage and the imagination to determine that he'll do it, even though it might produce some political difficulties for him at home. We were dealing essentially with two political systems that were not particularly attractive and which were treating their own people, as well as some other people, in a rather one-sided fashion. But the fact that they were feuding was of advantage to us, and the fact that one of them was a rising threat to us, namely the Soviet Union, particularly with its military aspirations, and the other one was opposed to the Soviet Union, clearly dictated the advantages of some accommodation. So we had to bite the bullet, and that was a difficult task. We tried to do it at first without biting it, and the Secretary of State went, and that didn't work, in part also because the Secretary of State really wasn't inclined to think of the relationship with China as directed at the Soviet Union. So for them, it wasn't such an attractive option. They were concerned about their security at that time too, and a deal with us in which there would be some understandings regarding the state of affairs in the world and the nature of the threat that the Soviet Union was posing for them or for us created the basis for a dialogue that was real. And besides, in some ways, although I don't want to exaggerate this in any way, somehow or other, Deng and I just were able to communicate very easily and directly. And that led, to a very frank discussion, not only of the issues at the formal meeting, but then to a supper with him in which he talked about his youth and how he became a communist and the mixture of communism and nationalism in his outlook, and how someday he hoped that he would really learn more about America and experience it. And I very boldly said to him, if you come to America, why don't you and your wife come to my house for dinner? And I never thought it would happen, but within a year, we normalized relations. And when I reminded the Chinese ambassador of that exchange, I got word within a few days that Deng and his wife would like to come to dinner to my house, something which never happened in the history of China. The ruler of China in a foreign country would go to some private home for a private supper. Incidentally, he gave a speech very shortly after this initial breakthrough in our relationship about the need for a wide-ranging economic reform in China. So it's quite clear in retrospect. It wasn't clear to me at the time, but it was clear to some of my people who were working in China, like Michael Oxenberg, who contributed a great deal to this, that in Deng's mind, this accommodation with America was also connected with a dramatic change of course in China's economic development. And of course, that was right. It was actually propagated by the people in the State Department, and it made the mass media and so forth, which prompted President Carter to do something which I did not ask him to do, and I only learned after he did it, namely write a letter to Foreign Affairs, the magazine that deals with these issues, in which he explicitly says that he ordered me to cut the State Department out of the process because he had no confidence in their capacity to handle this discreetly, secretly, which it had to be done that way. And that's exactly what happened. Now, I will not claim that I was particularly reluctant in executing his instructions. That's a different subject. But I also share the view that it's either done by us, our way, or by them. And their way was tried and it didn't work. So let us try our way and see if we can do it. I kept a diary as a kid, 10 years old or older subsequently. It was entirely about the war, just totally. I mean, that was my reality. And I think I've mentioned earlier in our conversation how very lonely I felt when everybody was celebrating victory over Hitlerism. And I was delighted by that victory and longed for it. But at the same time, the reality for me was the victory of Stalinism at the same time. And so I had a sense of an unfulfilled mission, which I think was probably in the background of a lot of what I did. And it was not some sort of a paranoid obsession, but increasingly as I became more and more mature and understood the nature of the problems that we're confronting, it was a sense of mission to try to take advantage of what I knew to set in motion a chain of events by foreign policy, by influence or by direct management of foreign policy, in directions which I hoped would fulfill what many people died for in the course of the war, which is a world that's more decent and more responsible than the world that plunged into that war. And that certainly was the legacy. But in a way, I find it rather striking that at this stage of my life, I again see some problems in the global scene that are not like the ones that we confronted, but pose risks that could become comparable if we don't act intelligently. And what I find very troubling about contemporary America is the scale of the public ignorance and the tendency, even within the elite, to reach out for simplistic black and white concepts as a way of solving the problems that we confront. And I find that very troubling because America is still the most important player on the global scene. And we can only act intelligently if we have an intelligent public and an intelligent, non-demagogically influenced elite. Because without both contributing both support and depth of understanding, no president can operate effectively. And I fear that today, when you read about the Middle East, it's a competition in slogans, an escape from reality that dominates a lot of what we have been doing. World War II was a prolonged, bloody, physical struggle in which each side used the maximum of power to prevail. Today, we can't do that because power has become so totally destructive that it is also self-destructive. You know, anybody who engages in nuclear war is likely to be doing it vis-a-vis countries that have also nuclear weapons, and that's it. Secondly, the publics are now politically awakened. So if we don't use your maximum power, you cannot crush them. You know, we have waged several wars since 1945. We didn't win decisively a single one of them because so-called People's War is a prolonged, exhausting war. We have fought 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last decade or so. And we're going to leave with the issue yet to be resolved. So that's part of this political awakening. We are now dealing with a world in which power is more spread out. From Napoleon to 1945, one could argue legitimately that control over Europe meant control over the world. This isn't the case anymore. Now there's Asia, but then there's also this awakened public in the rest of the world. So no one can control the world. So where does this lead you? I think it leads you to the very simple but frustrating conclusion that the only way to manage the world is to manage it on a collective, accommodating basis with other countries that begin to have a shared sense of interest in some measure of stability and accommodation, that who begin to feel that the kind of turmoil that's percolating and increasing is going to consume them as well. And what strikes me about our present moment is that I have the sense that in a cumbersome, clumsy fashion, the Russians are beginning to realize that they're potential victims, and the Chinese are beginning to realize that they're also potential victims, not to mention a lot of others. And that if we're clever, perhaps we can use that realization to resolve some problems which we cannot resolve entirely on our own. Theoretically, we should be able to beat the hell out of the Syrians, out of the Lebanese, out of the Iranians, out of the Afghans, and whoever else you want to mention. But we can't, because the nature of our power is so revolting to our principles that we cannot do it. We would have to be willing to say, we're going to kill them all. Well, you could say that at a time when everybody used swords, and you know that you could only kill so many people a day, and the other people could have swords too, and at some point you had to stop. Nuclear power is the converse of that. It's so totally effective that it's impossible. And at the same time, the publics are so awakened that they're no longer pliant. And that, I think, calls for a totally different style of leadership. Maybe, and this is what I've said actually publicly earlier in the summer of 2013, that maybe the conjunction of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of the Syrian adventure, whatever it means and however it was started, and the possibility of exploding in the Middle East, complicated further by the American-Iranian tension and the obvious desire, at least of some Israeli leaders, to get us into war with Iran, is creating such a problem not only for us, but for others who realize that they'll be potentially affected by it, that we may actually resolve this problem together because of that reality. Now, whether that can be translated into something that's applicable on a much wider basis, I'm not so sure. For example, I've spoken recently to some Chinese leaders who told me very bluntly that they're very worried after what will happen once we have left Afghanistan. Now, they know they can't keep us in Afghanistan, but they also know that once we leave, we may be more indifferent to what happens near Afghanistan, which is Central Asia, and eventually their regions. And I think that applies to the Russians as well. So we're probably going to have a world in which there are some accommodations and at the same time some additional novel forms of turmoil here or there in parts of Africa, for example, in Central Asia, and so forth. Within Russia, maybe. To some extent, since we're talking, let's remember when we're talking right now on the brink of October 2013. And there are these signs of possible accommodation, which I have begun to feel in my bones was possible already 3 months ago. That is an acknowledgement of the fact that the way we have conducted ourselves since we became, quote unquote, the only superpower in the world was not so smart. But that since we're no longer that, given the other realities, maybe some form of painful accommodation with things that we don't like to accommodate with is unavoidable. We'll take Iran, for example. Does it really make sense to start a war with Iran in order to prevent it from having nuclear weapons, which it doesn't have yet? When we so successfully prevented the Soviet Union, which in the end had thousands of nuclear weapons. And we should look at the Chinese in this regard, for example. The Chinese have 40, 50 years after they acquired the capability to have nuclear weapons, only a minimal nuclear deterrent. And they think that's enough. Now, who's been cleverer here? We or they? I think someone following, let's say, along the path that I took, has to now increasingly think globally and think how to use the elements of power, influence, seduction, compulsion, and self-protection to cope with these new now truly global dilemmas. I think this is clearly a global century, and I hope my children and my grandchildren live in that century peacefully and happily. But I'm not so sure that they will.